What if God didn't just make everything, but God was actually everything? Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I'm joined by Andrei Buckareff, Professor of Philosophy at Marist University, New York. His work covers the metaphysics of mind, human agency, and cognitive science. He also has a special interest in the topic of pantheism, about which he authored a book in 2022, published by Cambridge University Press. Andrei, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Mohammed.
Let's kick off. Can you just explain what pantheism is in a nutshell?
In brief, pantheism is the conception of God according to which God is identical with the cosmos. I think that's the best way to describe it. I think just about every conception of pantheism is going to be committed to, every version of pantheism, will be committed minimally to that claim. Exactly what constitutes the cosmos and what is it about the cosmos that makes it the sort of thing that is appropriate to refer to as God. There you start finding some differences amongst proponents of pantheism.
So just for clarification, so God is not in any way outside of or beyond whatever we define as the cosmos.
Right. Yes. So, yeah. So any sort of transcendence, any sort of notion of ontological transcendence where God is somehow of a different kind of being, as it were, right? From, if you will, sort of the everyday objects around us, right? That notion would be rejected by the pantheist. So
okay, so not a different ontological ground or an ontological stuff category, but nevertheless could be more than the cosmos as we see it or are able to detect it.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, a lot of it depends on the specifics of the variant of pantheism. Here we have to be really careful because, a close neighboring position is panentheism, according to which the cosmos is an aspect of the divine, right? It is, if you will, a part of the divine, whether a proper part, where that's the sort of common sense notion of parthood, right, where something is a piece of something, or if you have a sort of, where the universe might, let's say the cosmos might wholly constitute God, but God is somehow a little bit more than that. There's some ontological distinction there where there's at least there's an addition of being beyond what you might describe at the cosmos you'll get with panentheism. So here I think we have to be really careful. So if we're too capacious with our notion of what the cosmos is, we might wind up with panentheism. So I prefer, now this gets to more, I think, informative definitions of pantheism. I think the most interesting versions of pantheism are going to identify God with the physical universe. So whatever physics tells us is a completed physics would tell us would be constitutive of the physical universe, that state of affairs, that totality, that is the thing with which God would be identified. Versus, cosmos plus, where cosmos again is understood as physical universe. So, so that I think is a way to sort of keep it as being an approach that is easy to distinguish from panentheism. The way that I like to think of it is pantheism stands to the relationship between pantheism and panentheism. They're a bit like, if you look in the philosophy of mind, at the metaphysics of mind, you'll get, reductive physicalists or reductive monists, let's just use that language, and non-reductive approaches that still are going to prioritize, say, the brain. And panentheism tends to be, I think, a lot of times is a bit more like the non-reductive views of the mind, which oftentimes it's really hard to pin down how they're different from versions of dualism. So similarly, I think with some versions of panentheism, it's sometimes hard to distinguish how they're different from theism. But then on the other hand, sometimes if you're going a little bit further in the other direction, it starts looking more like the reductive views, right? So similarly, right, you get versions of panentheism that look much more pantheistic. Whereas pantheism, to me, it's a little bit easier. It's more tractable. It looks a bit more like the identity theory, which is just the mind is the brain. So similarly, the thought here is God is the cosmos. So that's just, I just use that as an analogy here. It's not a perfect one, but I think it's at least one way that you might think about the relationship between these two different conceptions of God that are close neighbors.
Okay, so if you're identifying God with the cosmos, are you then saying that God is material, is matter, as physicists understand it?
Maybe not as physicists understand it. It depends. Most pantheists. So now we can start making these additions beyond the identity claim. Historically, pantheists have said, or proponents of pantheism have said that the universe, the cosmos, exhibits a kind of unity, right? Some sort of unity that makes it divine. Now, I think the kind of unity that it's going to exhibit, if it's going to be, again, an interesting hypothesis and an interesting sort of conception of God to sort of consider alongside other conceptions of the divine, the kind of unity I think is the kind of unity that's characteristic of cognitive systems. That is to say, the cosmos would be a mind, a cosmic mind, and God is identical with that thing. Now, if the universe ends up exhibiting the kind of integration that's characteristic of a mind, then, right, it's going to have some properties that may not be identified by even a completed physics. So there's two different approaches here. One way to say it is to say, look, physics tells us, identifies everything that there is. And so, if we have a completed physics, it would tell us about everything there is. But now the second question is does it tell us everything about everything there is, right? And so the pantheist, I think, and here's where pantheism oftentimes has been uh, many people who have endorsed pantheism historically have also endorsed panpsychism, the notion that that in this case mental stuff is fundamental. And so there's different approaches to this. One approach is to say the mental stuff is more basic than the physical stuff. Another approach, which is the approach I think is more interesting and at least maybe I find more appealing, just given my own commitments in other areas in philosophy, is one where again it just is physical stuff, but physical stuff has this side to it, if you will, that physics is ill prepared to tell us about, because that's a side that has to do with subjectivity, right? So the thought here is take ourselves, right? The assumption here would be I'm a physical system, and there's something it's like to be a physical system. That doesn't mean that there's anything more fundamental than the physical stuff. It's just the physical stuff also happens to be stuff that is conscious. So again, many people historically have thought that there are these, if you will, two sides to physical reality, if you will, right? Where there's this conscious phenomenal side and the side that's being described by physics. But again, others have said no. What's more basic is the mental stuff, if you will, right? That's ground zero, and that's God, right? So here you get versions of idealism, right? Where now what you're doing is you're identifying, again, God with that totality, but God is also the ground, right, if you will, then for the physical stuff. But again, that whole system itself, right, which is again this information processing system and everything else that you might want to think of with a mind, is going to be something that is again, that is the whole thing is a mind. Sorry, and it's again for the idealists, the if you will, the ontological basis of everything is that mental stuff, if you will. So again, there's different approaches that you could take here.
Yeah.
But I think what everybody's going to agree on is who endorses pantheism historically is that you have, right, this one thing, which is the cosmos. God's identical with it. It exhibits this appropriate kind of unity. And whether or not that goes beyond what physics describes, well, again, I think many of them are, at least contemporary versions of pantheism, are going to want to say, no, physics tells us the story about what this stuff is, but it doesn't tell us the complete story about everything there is, right? So,
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of stuff there.
yeah, I'm sorry.
So no, that's fine. So but it sounded really clean cut at the start. It was, in the same way that reductionist views of mind can put it all down to matter. So an analogous thing would be to say that we could say that the divine is identical with the cosmos. But when you start going into kind of mind being different to or beyond what can be captured by how we describe matter or waves or whatever, it kind of feels like a little bit of dualism is creeping in.
Mhm.
And when we talk about a mind which has a ground, which is also itself, again, I kind of feel maybe a little bit of separation is coming in there. It feels like the unity bit is being stretched slightly. Am I
Yeah,
misinterpreting?
I think that's a fair worry. I think as far as so again, my preferred way of approaching these things is to say you have one reality that admits of two different descriptions.
Okay, like wave, particle, kind of light,
Yes, exactly.
photon,
What
photon
physics
wave.
tells us. You're right. And then the other description is a phenomenal description. But again, that's only known from the standpoint of being a subject. So now, again, the thought here is I'm a physical system. There's something it's like to be me. And the thought here is it's the exact same stuff that has these, if you will, it's Janus faced, if you will, right? That's one way
Okay.
to think about it, right?
Is this like material mental monism? Is it a bit like that?
Uh, yes, at least on one version. So there's two ways to go here. Again, you could go the route of the idealist. The idealist is going to say ultimately the stuff is just all mental stuff. That's all it is. So that's the way. That's one route. Physics is not really the story that it's telling is really just one of about appearances, and not the deeper reality. So that I think is one approach that you do find. That's not the approach I
Do you find that?
favor.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you find that the kind of Bernardo Kastrup type thing? Do you find that convincing?
No.
No, why
but
not?
but it's because of my views in philosophy of mind. So, so I tend to think, I want to so I personally uh favor both. I think ontological naturalism, where I'm just saying that's the thesis that the only things that exist are constituents of the physical universe. That is consistent with idealism. You could just say, oh, but it just happens that stuff is just mental stuff, as it were. But I also like methodological naturalism at the same time. So I do want to avoid having my theories be too far away from I don't want there to be too much distance between my metaphysical speculation and what the sciences, what our best sciences tell us about the way the world is. So I want things to be as grounded as possible, and I don't mean in a metaphysical sense, but just rooted and stemming from and on a continuum with our best science. That's what makes pantheism, I think, interesting to me, because part of at least what pantheism claims versus other conceptions of the divine is that, again, the version of pantheism that I find most appealing is, again, that the universe is a mind. The conception of the mind that I find to be most attractive is one where the universe, minds are information processing systems, right? And if the universe doesn't exhibit the requisite kind of integration, well, then it's not God. So you at least have a sort of empirically confirmable or disconfirmable, at least a principle theory, right? If the universe is not the kind of place, if you can't actually have the kind of processing of information at a cosmic scale like you have with systems like us, you have nothing that even approximates that. Well, then it's not a mind. In which case, that strikes me as then, well, that's a reason to think that the universe is not divine. So, in that respect, I think pantheism, at least the version that I think is most interesting, a kind of naturalistic pantheism, where you have this cosmic mind hypothesis, is, I think, really fascinating for the reason that presents us with a conception of God that is susceptible to the kind of disconfirmation that you don't have with traditional theism or even some panentheistic conceptions of God. So, or even some idealistic versions of pantheism, for instance, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That bit that makes some sense. The issue though of what you call the divine or God simply being the meta view of this consciousness, an atheist might say, well, why even give it those labels of divine and God? They're such loaded labels.
Yeah.
They come from a religious background. Why are you adopting those labels?
That's a really good question. Well, okay, I've written a little bit about this. So I think one place to start here is with a conception of an ultimate, right? So this is, I think, a better way to approach philosophy of religion. I think the mistake in a lot of Anglophone philosophy of religion has been um, just devoted primarily to just the conceptions of an ultimate that you find in the Abrahamic religions, particularly Christian theism, more specifically. Um, and I think a more useful approach in the philosophy of religion is one that was perhaps first suggested by, maybe not by John Schellenberg first, but he's one of the persons who I think most effectively articulated this idea, which is, look, we have candidate conceptions of an ultimate, right? And there are certain sorts of characteristic features of ultimates that you can see across religious traditions, right? You have something that is, um, uh, you know, uh, greater than other things, right? So it's sort of a something that exhibits a sort of, how can I put this effectively? Well, in his case, he talks about transcendence. I want to avoid that, but something that in this case exhibits a kind of axiological ultimacy, right? It's something that's an object of great value.
There's that which beyond which there is nothing greater.
Yes, yeah, that's one way to frame it. And so now then you start thinking about, well, what would be right characteristic features of an ultimate? And so I think that in the case of pantheism, now, versus, you might talk about a pan-ultimism even. And I suggested this before. I think some people who describe their views as pantheistic are better described as pan-ultimists. They just want to say the whole totality, the universe is something that is an object of religious devotion. Okay, great. The theist side of it, the pantheism side of it, this is where I think the mind hypothesis comes in, right? Which is the universe as a cosmic mind. If you look at traditional theism, God's a mind. God is a kind of mind. And in the case of classical theism, God is ontologically simple, right? God doesn't have any parts and all that kind of thing. But that looks a lot like a Cartesian soul, right? So so you have this sort of idea of there being a mind. So this is where I think the pantheism part comes in, the God part, which is the mind hypothesis. So if you go back to early statements of pantheism. So this is, of course, controversial. I'm not a historian of philosophy. But if you look at the sort of clearest statements of pantheism before pantheism got labeled pantheism in the late 17th century by Toland and others, you get people like Spinoza and the Stoics. Those are two good examples of this. And both of them were presenting a conception of God as a mind. And so yeah, you get this mind idea, okay? Mind, God, okay. But wait, now you've got the atheist or atheist interlocutor that you're mentioning here, who's saying, well, why call that God? Well, all right. So now, what I want to say is, and maybe here I'm going to push the Stoics and Spinoza to the side because I don't want to say that they're going to be on board with any of this. But my thought here now is go back to that idea of an axiological ultimate, something that's an object of great value. So the thought would be, if you had the entire universe exhibiting the kind of unity that's characteristic of a mind, then what you have is the universe would constitute an organic unity. And so here there's organic unities are going to be systems that exhibit, again, some sort of tight mode of unification between a number of disparate parts. And so the thought would be, and so the first person to articulate this idea in a lot of detail was Robert Nozick, but Roderick Chisholm also discussed this in his work. And the thought was, where you have an organic unity, you have something that is, again, so just think about a painting as a good example of this, right? Think about a painting. A painting would be a nice, right, small example of an organic unity, a small scale case of this, right? Where you have all these colors. And, it could even be a Jackson Pollock painting for that matter, right? It exhibits a kind of unity as a work of art with all these disparate features. In this case, the disparate features in this case is going to be the range of color that you see on the canvas. But the canvas itself is one of the features, right? That's going to be constitutive of the work of art, again, as something that exhibits the requisite kind of unity. And of course, right, you might say, this might be a reason why somebody might think, let's say a Pollock work might be less valuable than, I don't know, a Rembrandt, right? And this is all very subjective to me, but but you're talking about maybe perhaps somebody might point to certain features of the Rembrandt that are missing in the Pollock piece, right? The Pollock piece, right, in this case, it's, his methods of painting, such as they were very unconventional. And somebody might insist that owing to the lack of, right, because of how unconventional it was, it seems to exhibit less unity than, let's say, I think that's what they're gesturing to, right? When it comes to, let's say, that versus the Rembrandt, right? The Rembrandt, right, exhibits, again, a wide range of color, but now, right, you have all these various sorts of features that are brought together in this kind of almost a snapshot of a moment, right? That might be part of a narrative, right? In his case, right, particularly when it comes to, right, paintings that are about, biblical events and these sorts of things. And so the thought here is right, that work of art is, again, that's an organic unity. The reason why it's something that is an object of value is because, right, it exhibits that kind of unity between all these different parts. And the thought now would be, if you consider the universe now as a mind, it would constitute an organic unity, in which case, right, it would then be something that exhibits a great deal of intrinsic value, is the assumption here. So now, okay, what's the relation between value and then deity? Well, here, there's a separate line of argument here that one can appeal to, which was, I think, forcefully argued for by Ryan Byerly in a paper of his called "An Awesome Argument for God," or for Pantheism. And the thought was, contemplating the universe now triggers these feelings of awe, right? And if you're used to thinking about theism or just conceptions of the ultimate in terms of Christianity, awe is not the starting place for, it's not the central religious attitude. Let's put it that way. Whereas in Judaism, awe is central as being sort of the sort of, if you will, that's the starting place. Right? That's where things, if you will, sort of the seed of religious devotion starts with awe. And I'm sure that's true in other religious traditions as well. Of course, with Christianity, the emphasis is all upon faith. Here, then, Judaism, awe. And what Byerly argues is the universe ends up being the proper object of these feelings of awe. Somebody else who's talked about this, but not in the case of the universe, is Howard Wetstein within Judaism and the centrality of awe. And so the thought now would be, now you're having this feeling of awe, and what you're responding to now is the universe exhibiting this kind of unity, right? And so the thought is that is a, if you will, I don't want to say evidence for, but what you're tracking is something that is at least suggestive of this, it being appropriate to use the language of God for that
Yeah.
system. Again, assuming that it's a system that exhibits the requisite kind of unity, right? So maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things I think people who are new to this topic will find hard is the whole concept of differentiation. Who is doing the viewing of the universe and feeling the awe? Because ultimately, that is also God, right?
Good question. It depends. It depends on if you are talking about a distributive pantheism versus collective pantheism. So Graham Oppy made a useful distinction in a 1997 paper of his that was published in the journal The Monist between distributive and collective pantheism. And you find versions of both of these in the history of pantheism. The distributive pantheist will say, yes, you are divine in some sense. I think that the person who does that is committing the fallacy of division. So the fallacy of division happens where, let's say, just take you as a human organism, right? So you and I were human organisms, right? Now the retina of my right eye is not a human organism, right? It's a human retina, sure. But it's not itself, right? Again, it's the retina of a human, I should say, right? It is not itself a human being, right? And so the thought here would be a reason to reject distributive pantheism, which again, the thought is the whole is divine and now you've got divinity all throughout it. It's a bit like, again, committing that sort of fallacy of division. Again, similarly, think about, an automobile, right? The tires on the automobile are not an automobile, right? So similarly, I want to say, right, the opposite of the other approach is to endorse collective pantheism. Collective pantheism is going to say, no, it's the whole. The whole is divine. It's the entire system. The parts of it are not divine. So that version to me strikes me as being more promising.
Now, this is linking back to your analogy with brain and mind type of thing. That, you start off with neurons and you get to kind of synapses and networks, and you get to a certain level where there's so much going on, so much sophistication, that now we're going to call that level mind.
Yes.
And here you've got certain levels of consciousness, but once you get to the whole, now we're going to label that as divine. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Again,
fine.
that's for the collective pantheist. That's the version
Yeah.
of pantheism I think is most plausible.
So you and I can still exist, okay, as individual entities which in ourselves are not divine.
Yes.
And we can both look at the greater and refer to that as the divine.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. That's sounding a little bit like theism.
It is. Yeah. And that's hence the pantheism aspect
Yeah,
of it.
exactly. Yeah.
That's where I think it becomes more interesting as a sort of candidate conception of God versus panultimism.
But some of the crucial differences between this and classical theism are that we're not inheriting concepts of what this divine is. That is open to exploration.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's open to, confirmation or rejection based on philosophical or scientific or whatever exploration. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes. So in principle, it can be disconfirmed.
Okay. And then what is the nature of the relationship of you and I to this greater? You've mentioned awe, but what about things like gratitude? What about things like worship?
I haven't personally written on, further. I do have a paper that's very much in its seed stage, as it were. It's just in very rough outline form on faith, where I think faith for the person who endorses pantheism looks a bit more like accepting an hypothesis. Maybe that seems a bit less, religiously interesting, but it's I think you're still talking about very much a very different view, of course, again, of God. So maybe it shouldn't be surprising. But now what about gratitude and worship? That's interesting. Here you can look at the work of some people. Here I think the less philosophical works on pantheism end up being more interesting. So you get people like John Burroughs. Burroughs was a late 19th century, early 20th century American naturalist. In fact, his residence was just up the road from where I live, and in the Hudson Valley, in New York, and he described himself as a pantheist, and he was somebody who had a reverential attitude towards nature, and saw, if you will, his cathedral is the woods. It was being in nature qua nature, as it were, right? And experiencing it on its own terms. And he uses language of religious devotion. I don't know if I don't recall offhand if he uses the language of worship or not in there, but there are these attitudes of reverence and gratitude and whatnot that he seemed to regard as being appropriate. Now, again, this is somebody who was not a philosopher, not even a great scientist. I mean, he was, he's an American naturalist who's just has these, he was really more of a literary figure, if you will, right? And as such is really a delight to read, but can be, scientifically and philosophically unsatisfying at times. But again, he does use that kind of language. And I think that's one way to approach it. Would be, it seems justifiable to have these sorts of attitudes of gratitude and even reverential attitudes that would be characteristic of worship on the part of the person who's the pantheist. So it strikes me as being consistent with it. But I'll just quickly note that, I don't think there's anything inconsistent with, let's say, a person who endorses a pantheistic metaphysics of the divine participating in conventional religious observance, like in the form of going to temple or going to mosque or to church or whatever. Because you do find pantheistic strains within the world religions, when you've had, so take Judaism just again as an example. where you've had people who there are these sort of pantheistic elements, right? So you think about Kabbalah and things like this that look pantheistic, and there are people who are better trained in this area than myself who have mentioned, and we were talking with Yitzhak Malamed about this, and him mentioning to me that that there are these sorts of currents, right, within the history of Judaism. I mean, never mind Spinoza, but just in the history of Judaism itself, um, where people have had pantheistic, conceptions of God that they're working with, and of course are still involved in the life of the religious community. And of course, you see the same thing in Hinduism, and arguably there are some Christian figures who are marginal, and some figures in Islam who are marginal. You know what I mean? Where it gets a little bit close. So I think that one could still even be involved in a regular, in sort of, the sorts of religious observances that people are most familiar with, uh, and have a pantheistic metaphysic of the
Sure.
divine. Yeah.
Definitely, and Ibn Arabi in the Muslim kind of tradition was famously accused of things like
Yeah.
pantheism for his views. But what I'm interested in is somebody who has. I'm interested in why a philosophical pantheist stops short of going that next stage further, because humans, as humans, with all our psychological tendencies and needs, do have this tendency of wanting to give thanks, or wanting, for example, someone, I won't say you, but let's say somebody who has views like yourself, has a beautiful child, and they feel this sense of immense, they're overwhelmed with emotion, the sense of gratitude. The natural place to direct that would be to this universal mind, who surely was in some way behind that. Why would they stop short, do you think, of simply? Because I'll tell you why. I met a person recently, who said that whenever they have something important in their life, they kind of talk to the universe.
Mhm.
So they need guidance, they call on the universe. That something happens in their life which is difficult, they ask help from the universe. I mean, I'm guessing that's a kind of pantheism, possibly, but it's kind of religious pantheism. What I'm trying to go, why would a philosophical pantheist who is convinced of it not allow their human emotions to follow on from that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I also find it, that I think that would be a bit odd if one is a convinced pantheist, not to, engage in any such practices, be they habits of mind, right, or explicit, right, practices that are overt. Uh, yeah, I suppose that would be a bit odd. The only thing I could think of is that perhaps in just regarding it, the totality as an object of value and an object of awe, that the perhaps the thought would be that these additional sorts of exercises might be seen as being superfluous in some way. But again, I don't see what the harm would be. So it would be, it seems odd, given that to your point, I think, and correct me if I'm mistaken about this, is the thought is right now that you're valuing something, that should imply a certain kind of motivation to respond to it in
Mhm.
a certain way.
And
Eh,
and desire to connect with something
yeah,
greater. I mean,
yeah, yeah. No, I think that would be odd.
Mm.
Yes. I mean,
Okay. All right.
so yeah,
Mm.
so that makes sense to me. So, but uh, yeah, I think again, go back to somebody like Burroughs, and I do think you see that sort of an attitude. Hence, right, part of an explanation in terms of his motivation to engage with nature in certain ways is, I think, owing to him seeing that nature as being something sacred, something that is um, you know, a proper, a proper object of certain religious attitudes. So yeah.
Mm.
So
Okay. Let's move on to something else. How does a pantheistic view account for good and evil in the world?
no, good question. I actually have a recent paper on this. Yeah, Eugene Nagasawa, with whom I've collaborated, he and I had two projects that we directed, that were funded by the Templeton Foundation, and we co-edited a book and some issues of journals. He has a book, The Problem of Evil for Atheists, and he presents the problem of a better title for that book would have been The Problem of Evil for Everyone. He just thinks that traditional theists do better than everybody else. But a criticism that I had when he talks about pantheism is that he doesn't engage with versions of pantheism that I think are going to maybe not have the problem that he identifies. And the big problem that he sees is that, right, you now have this totality that you're describing as being divine, but now it has evil parts to it, right?
Mm.
And not just evil parts, but now you're talking about parts that, I mean, so now think about things like, let's be careful here because I don't want to attribute too much intentionality on the part of the mind to then the emergence of life, but just think about things like, the evolution of life on this planet. That involves a great deal of violence and a lot of suffering that appears to be gratuitous. And this is now constitutive of this thing, which is, right, the divine. And so he thinks there's this significant problem of evil that the pantheist faces because, right, you now have this thing that you're describing as God that is now that has these characteristics that seem to be they're intrinsic features, right, of the totality. And so he thinks that is deeply problematic. And my response to him was to say, when it came to the unity that he describes, he never articulates what kind of unity is necessary. So I said, my response to him in a recent paper that was published in the Asian Journal of Philosophy is to say, well, okay, let's make sure we're characterizing pantheism, right, in a way that is charitable. Now, I think the most again, so made sort of the line of argument that I just gave to you, reasoning that I gave to you just earlier, which is the most interesting versions don't just say that the whole is divine, it's that the whole is divine because it's a mind, and now go back to the notion of organic unities, right? So now what you have is you have a system that exhibits as a whole a kind of value, right, as an organic unity. Now, that might not seem to be very satisfying to some because now what you're talking about is an organic unity that has evil bits to it. But let me give you an example of an organic unity where I think we would all say it's valuable, that involves right features that are negative. So let's suppose that you are in a great deal of pain. And owing to your feeling pain, I then empathize with you. I empathize in the sense of emotional contagion, right? So now I'm feeling ill even, right? So like I don't feel well, and it's owing to my sort of being a co-sufferer with you, right? In terms of my empathic response. That I'm exhibiting empathy is something that I think many of us are going to agree toward you and your suffering is something that I think most people are going to say is valuable, right? And the thought here is that would be a small scale organic unity. It's right, one person suffering and another person exhibiting an empathic response to said individual, right? And it's valuable that we have that state of affairs versus, of course, one where, let's say, I'm not feeling empathy, right? I'm feeling antipathy towards you, and I'm just like, So the thought there is now think about things on a grand scale, right? So now if we think about things on a grand scale, and here I don't want to, kick up to mystery or something like that, but presumably the thought would be that you would have a system that is going to, where there's this suffering, but right, the system itself, right, has integration that's similar to what I'm just describing between you and I. But now, okay. But how do you get that? Well, here's where I now think that one version of pantheism does better than another version. So you have impersonal versions of pantheism and personal versions of pantheism. So the impersonal versions of pantheism are going to say the cosmos is not a person. Okay. So question is right, what makes something a person? I think something that's going to count as being a person is going to be able to differentiate itself from other things. So that you kind of get these I-thou relations, as it were. And also, right.
So hang on, not just different, but the relation bit is the key bit there. It's not just the I and thou, it's the relation between
the
I
relation between the I and thou. Right. So where there's some kind of a distinction, it may not be ontological, okay, crucially, but where there is there are two discrete centers of consciousness, and there's a recognition of these discrete centers of consciousness. And then, right, there's a reflexive attitude, right, where like I can use the first person, right, to refer to myself. I can say me. So personal pantheism, this is a view that Michael Levin wrote a book on pantheism in the 1990s. He did not really, he thought personal pantheism was a dead end. Personal pantheism has actually experienced sort of a resurgence of interest over the last 20 years. In part, I think, because of the work of Peter Forrest. There's some other people too. And the thought here is wait, we can now talk about the universe not just as a mind, but as a person. But now, right, where you have, right, this discrete sort of, you can individuate, right, again, the attitude of the whole from the parts, right? So now there's you and I. So let's go back to that suffering that we're talking about. So now if personal pantheism is true, you now have this sort of meta level sort of cognitive processing, for lack of a better term here, that you might now identify with the cosmos, with God qua person, right? It's not God as being ontologically other, which the panentheist has, well, to some extent, right? Again, the whole thing is supposed to be unified in some way. So you don't have any sort of addition of being, if you will, right, to the cosmos. But now what you have is if you will, the cosmos having this sort of ability to now, right, distinguish between, right, its state of being, as it were, its state of consciousness, I should say, as a whole, and then, right, these individual parts. So now, if you have now, let's say, personal pantheism, I think the personal pantheist is going to be well suited to handle this problem of evil, because now what you can have is something a bit more like what I just described with two persons, right? With you and I. Now you have the suffering of individuals in the cosmos, and now you have the perspective of the divine mind qua person, now in this case exhibiting a sort of co-suffering with, right, the rest. And so the thought here is that the personal pantheist, I think, is even better positioned than the traditional impersonal pantheist, because now you get that organic unity that you'd have of a mind, but now you have the additional sort of organic unity that's characteristic of these sort of interpersonal relations, where you've got persons.
So it's like a relational theology type of thing you're bringing.
Exactly. Yeah. So notice this gets you even closer to theism.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully you see that.
So far, what's really interesting was, say none of us who had done, say philosophy didn't exist, right? Let's just say philosophy didn't exist. So the whole question of ontological ground, whether it's different or the same, that was just not in our vocabulary. We took that away. I think the difference between this personal divine cosmos, but beyond what physics can get, and what someone else might call a god, who is different to us in some way, that distinction is getting very, very narrow now, because we've got removed the discussion about the ontological ground, which was the main sticking point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. I think so. I mean, of course, what you're now going to be describing, though, with the pantheistic God, the personal pantheist God, so let's stick with that version right now. It's going to be, again, there's the identity relation, but in virtue of that identity relation, you're now going to have a being that's going to be limited in terms of its power. So there, I think, is also part of the answer there with evil, which is going to be.
Sorry, just to backtrack that. How do you get to an answer on the question of omnipotence or not omnipotence? How are you reaching an answer either way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. I mean, if you go with the traditional theistic description of omnipotence, where God can do anything that's logically possible, then of course, you're now, in terms of now talking about a cosmic mind, there's going to be lots of things that are logically possible that a cosmic mind wouldn't be able to do, because they're not physically possible, right? So you're going to now be, one way to think about this here, I think, is that the space of possibility here is going to be constrained by the actual powers of the physical universe, right? So if something is not going to be physically possible, then it's clearly not going to be metaphysically possible here. So you're going to have a being that couldn't do certain sorts of things that, say, the theistic God could do, right? So
But hang on, just in this view, is the way the physical universe is part of the volition of the cosmic mind,
oh,
or was it kind of imposed on it by something else?
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I actually took this up with somebody else before, and I have a paper that excuse
I
me.
love how you've just got a paper on every question.
This is what happens, right, with a
Well, it's
philosopher, right? So
academics too.
it's like
It's academics too.
you stumble across a problem and you're like, I got to write a paper on this. So right, I get my thoughts worked out, then I can, yeah. So um good. This is
Because
a
of course
really
that
good.
all relates to omnipotence or lack of omnipotence, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there is going to be a sense in which, any pantheist can say God, you could say God's omnipotent in the sense that, you know, uh, but yeah, you just have to be careful. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Let's
I mean,
backtrack.
so,
Let's
well,
backtrack. If
yeah.
something has a mind, does it automatically have a will?
Good question. I'm inclined to say yes. So I think it's going to be an agent in some sense.
Okay.
Um,
And
and
then yeah, go on, sorry.
and in the paper that is a work in progress, I presented it at the Society for Philosophy of Religion just a couple months ago. Um, the ontological framework that I work with in my work in general is one where I assume that all the properties of objects in the physical universe are powers, and powers they have a kind of directionality or intentionality built into them. So now you start getting right a kind of pan-intentionalism. You have intentionality all over the universe,
Mhm.
and so now you just think about, let's just use the language of the Big Bang and the singularity. The point here is you'd have this power that's directed at this manifestation, which is the universe, right? And not just the universe, but the universe as a place that's suitable for life. So you get a creation story here. That's what I'm trying to do in the paper, is get a creation
Okay.
story.
Yeah.
Um, but notice there would be what would be constraining the activity of this power would be the fact that it's something physical, right? So there's going to be things that are just not going to be possible given what that
But but
power is directed at.
but normally when we say there are constraints, physical constraints, what we mean is it has to follow what we call the laws of physics, right?
Yep,
But
yep,
presumably the laws of physics are an expression of this cosmic mind, unless
yes.
if they're not, then there's something ontologically prior to it, which is conditioning it. So again, the question still remains when you say it's conditioned by laws of physics, but they're still laws which it kind of chose, right?
In a sense, yes. I mean, I think the laws in this case are going to be just describing
Yeah.
how
How
those
it works
powers are
out.
how it works exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah. So there's clearly, I think, a sense in which you could say, you know, God on this picture could be omnipotent, albeit it's not the sense that the theist has in mind, right? What the theist has in mind is, again, this being who can do anything that's logically possible. And of course, there's going to be lots of things that are logically possible that are going to be, um, you know, impossible, right, for God on
Yeah.
this picture to do, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
so
as an amateur, I always thought this concept of logically possible doesn't make a lot of sense because it's all kind of imaginary anyway, right? I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
I don't have much patience for it myself, but that's beside the point.
Okay.
Um,
Okay, good, good.
and,
All
I, and, I,
right,
and
okay.
I and I worry about making metaphysical possibility getting too close to logical possibility, right? Because I
Yeah.
could conceive of all kinds of things that I don't think are possible in any interesting sense. so,
Okay. All right.
so yeah.
Let's move on to another topic. How does God, the divine, relate to time?
Oh, good one. Yeah. So, of course, right. Let's just assume that the universe is a block universe, right? So it's a four-dimensional block. Uh,
Just
ag-
explain that a little bit more for us if you
okay,
can. Just
good. So the thought here then is that just as things are extended in space, things then are also extended temporally. right? So what you're talking what right now, right? This is just I, right? That referent of I right there is just a stage in this object that is extended in space and time, which you could think of like a worm, right? And that would be Andrei Buckareff. Andrei Buckareff is uh, that four-dimensional object that came into being, right? That was born in
At
Seattle,
one point.
Washington,
Yeah.
right? And let's say he's going to die in upstate New York. And right, you have that whole right 4D object. That's me. Well, me right now. When I just said me is just one stage in that. That whole thing is Andrei Buckareff. Similarly, now the universe is like that. The universe is this whole big four-dimensional block, and so times and temporal locations are like spatial locations, right? So just like Manhattan is south of me where I am right now, similarly my death is later than now, right? So but it's there, right? So so the thought here then with the block theory is that, right, all temporal locations are equally real. Their ontological status is such that they are, no times are less real than others. There's nothing special about the present per se. And notice an upshot of that, of course, is going to be that the experience of temporal passage, right, our experience of this sort of dynamic, nature of time is an illusion, right? And so now if God is right identical with that, then you would have, right, this sort of, right, it would be an all at once sort of experience, right, of the universe. And so that's how I would see it, how it would end up working. But I've written on this because I think this is interesting, because now think about God's I've argued that an implication uh of pantheism is that if God is identical with this totality state of affairs, which is the physical universe, then God would then be processing information at all these space-time points. And so that's going to include my experience of temporal passage, right? But how do you explain the subjective aspect of temporal passage if the whole is all at once, right? So now it's just, your life, my life, all at once. You're not going to get that, I think, on the non-personal version of pantheism, where you don't have this sort of meta level perspective. So what I've argued in again another paper of mine is that if God, if personal pantheism is true, you could have God, right, adopting the attitude towards discrete points, right, in that, in the life of an individual, and could be experiencing that illusion that you're experiencing. Whereas if you don't have that sort of meta level perspective, you just have the whole all at once, which is going to
Yeah.
be phenomenologically, I don't know what that would be like. It's going to be very different from what you and I experience. But
No, we're not going to be able to get to that one.
but importantly though, if we get omnisubjectivity, right, you're not going to have omnisubjectivity, right? You're going to lose that, right? Because that's not what it's like to be you and me. To be you and I, it's going to be the case that we are experiencing time as passing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So God's relation to time is categorically different to our relation to time.
Absolutely. And again, you could get a God who could experience things the way that we do on one picture, namely personal pantheism, which I've argued for. But again, on the standard picture, it's just going to be an all at once thing. Again, very different. But you wouldn't have the added benefit of omnisubjectivity. So you'd lose that. So
Okay. Well, in our remaining 2 minutes between point A and point B in four-dimensional space, how does pantheism help you personally in your life, and how could it help other people in their lives?
good question. So I actually wouldn't call myself a pantheist. I think it's I think it's there was a time when I would. That's a topic for another occasion. But I am a pro-pantheist. So I think as an axiological option,
You're an ally. You're an ally of pantheism.
it would, if it's true, I want it to be true. Okay, so I think that'd be great. So as an axiological claim, I'm a pro-pantheist. I wouldn't describe myself as a pantheist. That being said, when I reflect on the benefits of pantheism, so now think about the pro-pantheist stance, the thing that I appreciate about pantheism, and that I think at times directly impacts me in terms of just my own lived experience, is the thought that you have, if you will, everything's hanging together, right? There is more of a sense of how there is this interconnectedness, right, between oneself and others. So go back to organic unities, right? An ecosystem is an organic unity, right? So the thought here is right, and think about the parts of ecosystems, right? They, these are elements that co-evolve together in certain sorts of ways, and when you disrupt that, the net effect is wholly negative oftentimes. And similarly, I think something is true when it comes to us and each other, and nature. So I think that harkens back to Burroughs. I think one thing that pantheism does is, and when one reflects on it as an option in the space of possibility here, is, I think it presents one with a picture that prescribes seeing oneself and interacting with others in a way that is not so atomistic, if you will, right? And hopefully, I think, should encourage people to appreciate where they are vis-a-vis nature, and to see the importance of actually, if you will, again, it sounds very hippy dippy, but being sort of right, seeing how you are a part of it's not humankind and God and then nature. It's all of one thing. It's they're all of a piece with one another, and so I think that you get this kind of an emphasis on, if you will, this kind of holism from pantheism that I think is very valuable, and I think should motivate people to recognize the importance of living in harmony with one another, and also, of course, with the rest of nature. So, but yeah, so I see a lot of value in that. But again, for various reasons, I wouldn't say I'm a full blown pantheist. But if we're talking about a hypothesis that's, again, I think it's plausible. I think in the space, when you think about the possible conceptions of God, I think it's the one that's the most attractive. So,
Andrei Buckareff, thank you very much for joining us.
well, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.